Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this event by the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society. This is part of our public lecture series, and I'm thrilled to have with us this evening Professor Mark Bevir from University of California, Berkeley, where he's the director of the Centre for British Studies. I think British studies are very interesting to many people across the world at the moment. Mark has written many books. Among these, we have The Logic of the History of Ideas, Interpreting British Governance, New Labour, A Critique, Democratic Governance, and most recently, a book with Jason Blakely, Interpretive Social Science. Here at the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society, we're very interested in the relationship between formal rules of governance, but also informal beliefs, social norms, and traditions, and how those interact with formal rules of governance. Now, many of the speakers that we've had at the centre and the researchers that we've had working with us understand that relationship through what we could describe as a broadly modernist or positivist approach to social science. The reason that I'm particularly excited to have Mark with us here this evening is that he brings a rather different take on that relationship. He approaches that interaction from the perspective of interpretive social science, which I think is a rather neglected approach to thinking about how we study society more broadly. If you haven't seen it already, I thoroughly recommend his new book on interpretive social science, which I think is a wonderful statement of what that approach can actually bring to social inquiry more broadly. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to us Professor Mark Bevir, who's going to talk to us about governance, a genealogy. Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you. I'm beginning to feel that having written a book called New Labour, A Critique makes me old. I mean, that's saying something, isn't it? Thank you. It's really nice to be here. I'm a Londoner, so it's always nice to be back in my hometown, and particularly at King's, surely the most beautiful of the London universities. I'm going to talk about governance and genealogy today, and this is really what I'm going to do. It's going to go up again at the end, so don't worry if you don't catch it all now. But really my argument is going to be, right, let's try and work this. My argument is going to be that we've moved from developmental historicism to modernism, that underlying it is a changing concept of rationality, and you can see we move along to new theories of governance, that's led to different state formations. We move along to where we are today, which is in some ways a neoliberal or network state. This changes the nature of the public sector so that we now live in new worlds of governance, markets and networks. Now, that, I hope, is fairly uncontroversial. So I'm not trying to say anything actually particularly distinctive about what governance is. I think a standard definition of governance would be that we have moved from a largely hierarchical, bureaucratic set of institutions within the state to a state that operates through and within markets and networks, more than, or at least as much as bureaucracy. I will at the end challenge that a little bit, but for most of the talk I'm going to accept that fairly generic, bland definition of governance. There was a British philosopher, a guy called J.L. Austin, who I quite like, wrote a lot about speech acts, who famously said that he was so busy doing what he was doing that he didn't explain why it mattered. And I think I've done the same thing. So in this talk, there are going to be 3, maybe 4 moments when I'm going to pause and I'm going to explain why what I'm doing matters, right? Because otherwise it wouldn't be clear. I'm really a theorist by background, and really, although it's about governance, the talk makes a series of theoretical points, but it really makes them by enacting them more than by straightforwardly stating them. And this will be a good point to mention the first thing that I think matters about this talk. And you will see that the driving force behind governance for me, what creates these new worlds of governance and markets, is a changing concept of rationality, right, which spreads out through theories. So what I'm claiming there is that to explain the rise of markets and networks within the state, we can't straightforwardly appeal to, say, changing social processes like globalisation. Or we can't straightforwardly appeal to just the interests of actors, like this was how Thatcher was going to be elected, or Reagan thought these policies would get him elected. Instead, we have to appeal to changing sets of beliefs or understandings, changing concepts of rationality. What I'm arguing then is that social science makes the world. Right? Most social scientists, this is the view of social science we normally get, is that what social science does is describe the world and maybe explain it. I think it sort of does those things, but what I think it increasingly does is make the world. The point should be obvious. It should be obvious that when social scientists come up with a set of ideas, let's pick a really good example for my argument, Keynesianism, and a bunch of policymakers are influenced by those ideas and adopt policies in accord with those ideas, policies that arguably could not have been adopted prior to those ideas arising, then those ideas, those forms of social science, have helped make the policies. So it should be obvious that social science, in a way, makes the policies that then make the world. But it's something that virtually never gets said. And not only is it something that virtually never gets said, in my view, it's something that has hidden but important consequences for how we think about what it means to evaluate or judge a theory within the social sciences. So that's the first point I wanted to kind of pull your attention to and draw out at this stage. Is there anything else to draw out at this stage? I guess the only other thing I would draw out at this stage, which isn't one of my big key points, so you can ignore it if you want, is that for me the big change occurs between developmental historicism and modernism. So although I've adopted a standard definition of governance as the rise of markets and networks, I'm framing it differently. Most people frame governance in contrast to government, so there's been a shift from bureaucracy to markets and networks, down here in the public sector boxes. What I'm arguing is that that shift, although I think something like it has happened, has all happened with what at the top right I'm calling modernism. So it's all taken place within a framing of modernist concepts of rationality. So the really big shift happened when we moved from developmental historicism to modernism. This matters because the subtitle of my talk is a genealogy. And like most genealogies, I'm tracing something historically, and I'm starting with something that's very different from where we end up. So if I start it with government, because I think it's got the same form of modernist rationality within it, I wouldn't be getting enough critical perspective on the world we have today. So instead, starting with the world that I hope looks very different from the world of today, that of the late 19th century, or indeed most of the 19th century, where the main forms of knowledge were developmental historicism. What do I mean by that? Well, in the 19th century, virtually every social scientist, historian, public official understood the world in terms of a historical narrative about the development of their state, typically a progressive narrative. You can think of Hegel, you can think of Mill, you can think of Marx even. There was a historical narrative that explained how the world developed and how it changed. And if you want to understand current events and explain them, you did so by inserting them within that narrative. And that narrative then guided policy. Right? So the narrative might vary, but the structure of it, the idea that what you were doing was telling a history that explained the facts by locating them in their relevant historical context, and where that historical process was largely progressive, was fairly common across all thinkers. Auguste Comte would be another, pretty much anyone you care to mention. Herbert Spencer, right, I think I've done enough examples. That developmental historicism, it withers away from about 1870 through to about 1920 across various fields for complex reasons. But probably the single most important and the easiest one to appeal to dramatise what I'm trying to say is World War I. Right? So the disaster of World War I makes it really hard to think of history as inherently progressive and rational. Right? So then people have to start to rethink how they're going to explain and understand the social world if they can't appeal to these progressive historical narratives. And what arises is what I'm calling modernism, which overlaps with, but I would be unhappy to have it reduced to, positivism. to some extent, I've already given you a clue how I'm going to define modernism. So I'm going to define it in contrast to developmental historicism. So whereas in the 19th century what you had was primarily historical narratives, diachronic stories across time, what you get in the 20th century is the rise of formal theories that are largely synchronic. They don't occur across time. Instead, they describe units within static moments, right? And they look more universal. There are two forms of this. One is tied to economic rationality. It's primarily deductive. It creates what we think of as neoclassical economics. So the idea is that across all times and all spaces, humans seek to maximise their utility, and they do so in predictably rational ways, and you can model that, and that's how you can understand economics and other things, loosely speaking. The more complex one to understand is how it happens within sociological fields, so what I'm calling sociological rationality. By and large, but not always, the main way that happens theoretically is the rise of a range of modes of understanding which appeal to things like systems and functions. So what you get is the theorist will postulate a whole. Let's say it's the state, right? That counts as a whole. And then you want to explain a part of the whole. Let's say you want to explain the executive, or let's call it, as functionists of the time would have done, the core executive, which is a concept that starts out within the descriptions of private sector companies and then migrates to be used to the state. Notice it doesn't even really refer to any fixed entity like the Treasury. It's not an institution. It's something that cuts across institutions, the core executive. And if you want to explain the existence of the core executive, you don't trace its history. Instead, you appeal to its function. And you say any system or any organisation must make decisions. Therefore, there must be some entity that makes decisions for that organisation. That entity is the core executive. Right? So the explanation you're giving, why is there a core executive, is one that relies on a functionalist mode of explanation rather than a historical mode of explanation. Other ways in which it arises is that you start to compare institutions with similar sorts of institutions across time and space and look for commonalities of those institutions, rather than treating them as institutions that have their own unique historical background. So a famous British political scientist, I think he moved to America actually after a while, a guy called Herman Feiner. He had an even more famous elder brother called Samuel Feiner. Herman Feiner wrote two massive textbooks, which were the biggest and most important textbooks in political science of the time. In the first one, he basically went through states, country by country. So I'm not very good at memorising things, but I think it goes something like, France, Germany, America, chapter on each. And then if you wanted to kind of compare, let's say, the French and German parliaments, you'd have to look up French parliament in the index, read about that, German parliament in the index, read about that. In the second one, he goes through much more institution by institution, legislatures, executives, and then if you want to put together the French system of government or the whole of the French government, you would have to look up French legislature, French executive, French judiciary, and piece them together for yourself. So even in the way in which textbooks are being organised, you can see this shift from a developmental historicism to something that looks more like sociological rationality. So that's the background to my explanation of the rise of governance. But of course, that's not getting us markets and networks at the moment. So why do we get a shift from government to markets and networks? Well, for much of the 20th century, economic rationality and sociological rationalities are housed within the state. I think it's a slight simplification, but not too much of a simplification, to say that economic rationality is housed primarily within the Treasury, and then increasingly, particularly in the social post-war period, forms of sociological rationality are housed within welfare departments. Right? So you find appeals to trying to understand the social origins of poverty, etc., which rely primarily on more sociological approaches. What then happens in the 1970s is that these forms of rationality turn against themselves. And instead of being forms of rationality that can be housed within the state, they come to offer critiques of the state. Right? And those critiques of the state, the hierarchic bureaucratic state, are what drive the programs of reform that seek to promote markets and networks. So let's look at that in more detail. There are two bits of reform turn to markets, turn to networks, they actually overlap a bit, but I'm going to analytically separate them as though they were completely different moments. That's not strictly true, but it kind of works well. So the first moment, hopefully, is going to be fairly familiar. And what we have is the rise of neoliberalism. And neoclassical economics and rational choice theory offer a critique of the state as being overloaded, inefficient, etc., etc. And they suggest, therefore, that you need to roll back the state, you need to spread markets, you need to spread contracting out, and you need to introduce the new public management. This is, of course, the world primarily of Reagan in America, Thatcher in Britain, but it extends everywhere over time, more or less. We'll get to the less later on in the talk a bit. So that's the first wave of reforms. There you go, that's my explanation. Because I rely on ideas so much, people sometimes say, well, how can you show that? So for each wave of reforms, I'm going to make a little token effort to try and show you how this works, right? And what I'm going to do is start by showing how a theory migrates from academia to constructing policies. And then I'm going to try and flesh that process out by appealing to a couple of individuals, right? In all cases, they should be understood as representative. They're not. I don't really want to say it's entirely due to them. I don't think it is. I think it's utterly implausible to imagine one person makes this happen. That's part of the problem with the question of show us how it happens. What happens is there's a change of climate of opinion. New ideas arise, typically within academia at first. Then they get picked up by think tanks, by policy advisors, by journalists, and they spread from there into government. Often there's some sort of crisis, and the new ideas are then adapted as a way of responding to the crisis. And what that means, apart from anything else, is that the key players in moving the ideas are often, in academic terms, minor figures. They're not the people who create rational choice theory. They're not Kenneth Arrow. They're minor players who do the work of actually constructing the policies in academic terms. But if we're interested in the history of the reforms, they can become very important. So for my first wave of reforms, neoliberalism, the theory I'm going to pick is principal agent theory. And principal agent theory, I'm sure most of you know this, basically says that if the principal creates an agent to act on their behalf, there's a danger that the agent will pursue the agent's own interests instead of those of the principal. Right? So it creates a moral hazard, as it's called. The first thing to note before I go into that in theory is that worry only makes sense once you have the rise of economic concepts of rationality. It's only the rise of the economic concept of rationality, which says people are rational actors pursuing their own interests, that will make you think the agent is likely to pursue the agent's own interests rather than pursue the principles. It's not a natural thought. It presupposes a certain theory to give you that idea. So the very worry presupposes the rise, in a way, of economic concepts of rationality, which is why you don't really get anything that would be called principal agent theory until after neoclassical economics has arisen. When it arises, around the 1930s, it arises really as a worry about the private sector, and particularly about Anglo-American capitalist enterprises. And the worry is that as you have shareholders who are not themselves working within the enterprise, what will happen is that the chief executive officer will pursue the chief executive, acting as the agent of the shareholders, will pursue his or her own interests, say a lavish corporate jet, rather than seeking to maximise the returns for the shareholders. Okay? So once you see that worry, once you have that worry, the question arises, what are we going to do about it? And within the private sector, they develop various responses. I'll mention the most obvious and prominent, which is performance-related pay. So what performance-related pay does is it aligns the interest of the agent with that of the principal. So if you say to the chief executive officer, your pay is going to depend on your performance in raising the value of the shares, then the chief executive officer has an interest in raising the value of the shares rather than buying the lavish corporate jet. Right? So you bring that performance-related pay serves to close the gap between the two interests. Again, note, it's a response to principal agent theory that presupposes, loosely speaking, an economic rationality as a way of understanding the world. And there it stays. You know, the companies introduce performance-related pay, the world goes its merry way, until the 1970s, when some public choice scholars working in public administration and public policy think, oh, that applies to the public sector. And there, the principle, it's never quite clear who the principle is. Sometimes it's the politicians who are the masters of the officials, but sometimes it's actually we, the people, whose interests should really matter. But something like the citizens or the politicians are the principals, and the bureaucrats are the agents. And the worry is that the bureaucrats will pursue their own interests, their power, their glory, their pay, having a nice, lean, dynamic department that they love working in, whatever their interests might be, rather than pursuing the interests of the politicians or of the people. It's quite a neat analogy, actually, with the private sector. And obviously it raises the question of, what are we going to do? Well, the answer's obvious. We're going to do exactly what they've done in the private sector. Right? So the private sector has already shown the way of closing the gap between the interests of principals and agents, e.g. performance-related pay. So once scholars think the same problem arises in the public sector, they adopt the same solutions. So you get the spread across minor departments and agencies of performance-related pay and other such measures. And these, loosely speaking, become what is known as the new public management. So you can see how the principal-agent theory relies on something like an economic rationality, applies itself over time from the private sector into the public sector, where it generates a set of reforms, new public management. Okay? Now, at that point, you could say, well, that's just a fit of ideas, right? The ideas fit together, but it doesn't really show that they influence one another. Fortunately, I have the heroes of my story. Meet Peter McKinley and Ralph Chapman. Peter McKinley and Ralph Chapman are civil servants, or were civil servants in New Zealand. They also double up as academics and consultants. Both had economics backgrounds, did PhDs in economics, and both devised New Zealand's public management reforms. Why does that matter? Because New Zealand's public management reforms are normally seen as being the first example of new public management in the world. So we know that Peter McKinley and Ralph Chapman were instrumental in crafting the white papers that inspired New Zealand's public management reforms, which were one of the, sometimes people evoke Chile, but apart from Chile, arguably the first big major example of the introduction of new public management. And we don't even need to just end there, because in the case of Ralph Chapman, he's very helpful. Ralph Chapman gets a year's sabbatical after the reforms. And he goes, my memory's really not great for facts, but I think it's to Oxford. It's certainly somewhere within the UK. So let's call it Oxford, because I know Oxford and I quite like Oxford. So Ralph Chapman goes to Oxford. And while he's at Oxford, amongst other things, he writes a scholarly paper, which is then published in Public Administration. So you can even go and look up Ralph Chapman, Public Administration, and see him discuss the New Zealand reforms for us. And he's quite clear, absolutely clear, that the main thing that distinguished New Zealand's reforms from those that went before, why they are not just another example of managerialism, why they are different, is because they are based on principal-agent theory. He specifically says that. That's what distinguishes the reforms, and that's what drove them. So not only do we know that he has a background in economics, that he did a PhD in it, we know because he tells us that the ideas that inspired him when he was crafting the first example of the new public management were ideas associated with principal-agent theory. Okay, now let's move on to my second theory. Let's pause here to just briefly have one of my second important points, because I expect quite a lot of people are fairly familiar, if not with the details of Ralph Chapman and Peter McKinley, at least with the bold story I just told, right? It's a well-known narrative of our times that this evil thing called neoliberalism arose and it tried to spread markets everywhere, and gosh, it was very, very bad. But often the people who tell you that are themselves practicing some form of institutional economics or institutional social science, and the baddie is very much neoliberalism. Right? Neoliberalism is actually a bad word. I can't remember ever hearing someone, well, a couple of people, but it's very rare you hear people go, yeah, I'm a neoliberal, right? It's really a word people use to describe something they don't like. In my story, of course, the baddie is modernism. And neoliberalism is just one variety of modernism. There's also institutionalist or sociological forms of rationality which are equally modernist. And in my story, they play exactly the same role. I've even had people say to me about institutionalism, but that's just plain good social science. As though obviously there might be something wrong with neoclassical economics and the neoliberalism that it inspires, but there can't be anything wrong with their beloved institutionalism. So I just want to point out, because they ignore this, that institutionalist modes of knowledge have basically played exactly the same role on what we might think of as the recent left, as economic forms of rationality have played on what we might think of as the right. So in the social democratic narrative, well, actually there are two narratives. Yeah. I don't like neoliberalism. Otherwise, I wouldn't use the word, right? It's a word we use for things we don't like. But part of my problems with this stuff is it's so wishy-washy. At least I can understand the arguments around neoliberalism, and I don't constantly need to qualify what I'm saying. Everything I'm about to say has to be a simplification of lists, or there are differences between what people are saying. And the first major difference is the difference within the social democratic or institutionalist narrative. So in one variety of narrative, the narrative says markets are inefficient as institutions. But bureaucracy or hierarchy is inefficient, but so are markets. And what we really need is networks. And that form of that narrative can take various forms. I'm going to give Berkeley a little boost here, and I'm going to mention Professor Williamson from the Business School, who got the Nobel Prize in Economics quite recently for his work on precisely this issue, right? And he talks about transaction costs, and how you have problems of transaction costs across markets, and you need ways of minimising those costs, and how relatively stable institutions, e.g. networks, are often a way of doing that. So one form of the narrative actually isn't institutionalist at all. It's rational choice. But other forms are much more institutionalist. There's a guy from a university we won't mention called Mark Granovetter, who argues, for instance, that if you're trying to deal with things like getting a job, what you find is that, and he uses classic institutionalist and sociological ways of doing this, so he looks for correlations and classifications across different cities. What you find is people find jobs through their networks, their social networks, right? So networks are good. We all know networks are good, right? I mean, network is such a buzzword now. Networks are good for anything and everything. You have to have your own network. Everyone has to have their own network. Can't stand them myself. So then networks are just inherently good because they have inherently good properties. My main collaborator on governance, a guy called Rob Rhodes, used to argue this. Right? He used to argue that networks were inherently categorised by relationships of trust built around resource dependency amongst the members within the network. Sounds complex, is no need why you should bother to understand it. But the other form of the social democratic narrative, which I quite like because it reminds me of being young, the other form of the social democratic narrative is slightly different. Instead of saying networks always and intrinsically have these good properties, they promote trust, they are good ways of exchanging resources across agencies that depend upon one another. Instead of saying that, the second version of the narrative says bureaucracy was good, but then we had globalization and information technology, and everything needed to move a lot quicker. And in those circumstances, bureaucracy is a bit sclerotic. So now, in our new world, we need networks. Right? It's the second form of the narrative. I like that form of the narrative. Unless you're very old like me, you won't know why I like that form of narrative, so I'm tempted to offer a prize to anyone who can guess why. I like that narrative because it originates in the British Marxist journal Marxism Today. And it's the New Times narrative. And it's how Marxists first made sense of Thatcher. And they said, we live in new times, which has destroyed the Fordist conjunction we were in, which supported the welfare state, and it's broken it down, and we need something else. And that's what's given rise to neoliberalism. And people who craft that idea, craft that narrative with Marxism Today, then go on and play a major role in New Labour. I'm blanking on his name. I've already told you I'm not very good with facts. But the guy who sets up Demos, for instance, and then goes on and runs the Number 10 think tank, started off writing articles like that for Marxism today. So that's the social democratic narrative. And obviously, what it's saying is the world is complex, networks are good. So what we need is not markets contracting out in the new public management, but rather networks, partnerships, and collaborative governance. Here too, I want to mention an idea and then flesh it out with people. So the idea I'm going to pick is wicked problems. Wicked problems. Great, isn't it? This is, again, a good example of how slippery this stuff is compared with the neoclassical stuff. So wicked problems, they're normally defined, when you find a definition of wicked problems, by a list of features, which is incredibly irritating because it's not remotely clear that all the features are necessarily going to go together at any time or anything like that. But the main feature, as far as I can make out, which occurs within all the lists and is certainly the most important for our purposes, the main feature of a wicked problem is that it cuts across departmental silos. Right? So I'll give you an example. Let's imagine that you're concerned with inner city crime or vandalism. So that's a problem, it looks like, for a Department of Criminal Justice. But then you find that most of the crime and vandalism is fairly petty and it's being done by school kids who are playing truant from school. Well, now it starts to look like a problem for the Department of Education. And then you find that most of the kids who are playing truant from school are from homes, let's say, where there's just a single parent who's out at work and the kids are latchkey kids. So now it starts to look like a social welfare problem. Right? So it cuts across all these different departments, and that's what makes it wicked, right? That you can't find a home where you can find a solution for it. How then are you going to solve wicked problems? The answer should be fairly obvious. You're going to get the different departments that are involved to cooperate, or, let's call it what it should be called, they're going to form a network to deal with wicked problems. The idea of wicked problems first arose amongst progressive planning theorists in the 1970s. Hurst and Wickel write the big article on it. And from there it spreads through planning theory into other areas, noticeably into joined-up governance. As far as I can make out, here too, my memory for facts is not going to serve me well in a minute. As far as I can make out, the first time joined up governance or anything like it appears in a policy paper is in Australia. And I think the title is Joined Up Governance, a solution to wicked problems. But it might be the other way round, right? But it has both wicked problems and joined up governance in the title. So again, it's explicitly clear in the policy paper that joined up governance, or networked governance if we prefer, is being introduced to deal with wicked problems, which suggests, I wouldn't quite want to leap to this conclusion, but it suggests at least to some extent that the turn to joined up governance or network governance presupposes a conceptualization of wicked problems in the way in which institutionalist planning theories have conceived of them. Okay? And my example here, a guy called Perry Six, British person, now teaches at Birmingham, I think. I might be out of date, but I think he's at Birmingham. Queen Mary, I am out of date. Perry Six, who at the time I'm talking about, was an honorary research fellow at Strathclyde University. And at Strathclyde University, he ran various conferences and workshops with titles like The New Institutionalism, a Neo-Durkheimian Perspective. Right? So we know he was interested in studying, exploring, trying to develop a new institutionalist research program, institutionalism at the top. At the same time, Perry Six was writing a series of articles come policy papers for the left-wing think tank Demos. Most of those have titles like Holistic Governance or The Housing Crisis, a holistic solution, right? So although it's not called joined up governance at this stage, it's called holistic governance. The basic idea is the same. If you're to deal with these wicked problems, if you're to deal with these problems within an institutionalist framework, what you need is some form of whole of government, which is what joined up governance becomes in the US, whole of government, holistic governance, joined up governance perspective. And then when New Labour's elected in 1997, Perry Six becomes one of the main advisors behind its modernising government white paper, which is the basis for its public sector reforms. So again, you can track through concrete individuals in this kind of nebulous world of think tanks, academia, policy advice. you can track people who wouldn't necessarily be prominent academics. And actually, when I write this stuff up, I don't really like to mention them because it seems unfair, because I'm picking on one person, and it's not, like I say, it's not as though it's that one person. So I tend to drop the names out. They tend not to appear because I don't want to suggest it's their fault. But when I'm doing a talk, I'm happier to use some particular person as my poster boy. I should actually probably switch Perry Six for Gerry Stoker, who was also avowedly a new institutionalist and was one of the main advisors behind New Labour's local government reforms towards networks, and has now written a couple of articles in which he's basically held his hands up and said what a big mistake that was. So he would work quite well as an example for that now. So I could sort of stop the talk there, couldn't I? Don't get too excited. I'm not going to, but I sort of could, right? I mean, what I've done is I've said, governance is the rise of markets and networks. And I've said underlying that is this big shift of rationality. And then you get two waves of reform, one inspired by economic rationality, one by sociological rationality. And then you have it, bingo. So I've kind of got us where we want to go. Right? But we're going to pause here for my third, I think I'm on third underlying theoretical point. And I'm going to start with a bold theoretical claim and then explain why it matters. And the bold theoretical claim is genealogies are not inherently critical. Right? So my approach so far, I've called it a genealogy. It's interpretive. It obviously, for those of you who know this sort of stuff, overlaps a bit with the kind of work you get in governmentality, Foucauldian work. It's fairly critical, sounds like I don't like the ideas. And there's some truth in that, but it's not. It pretends it is, but it's not. Imagine that I'm a new institutionalist. I could accept all of that. I could say, yeah, new institutionalism arose historically. It had this impact. By the way, it's right. Imagine I'm a neoliberal. I could say, yeah, of course, obviously we're indebted to Adam Smith and then later on to people like Hayek and Milton Friedman. Sure, we draw on principal agent theory. That's how we develop our policies. And they're the best policies going. And nothing I've said would challenge that. Right? And the way in which most governmentality work gets round that is by introducing a hidden concept of a reified and hidden concept of power. Right? It's often explicitly said as power, but power is the motive force. So what would make it critique is the apparent appeal to something called power. Right? So it would look like, well, what underlies the spread of neoliberalism is neoliberal power. Or what underlies the spread of network governance is network power, right? Power is the bad word because we all know power is bad. But there's a major problem there, which is the very people who are then appealing to power to get their critique up and running have also argued, and should argue, they're right to argue, that power doesn't have a centre anymore and that power is everywhere and always with us. And if power is everywhere and always with us, you can't do away with it. So to appeal to its presence is no longer inherently critical. Right? If power is productive and always there, it's not a critical concept in the way it was. And the way they get around that is a tacit form of functionalism. So what you then get is a stipulative definition of something like neoliberalism as the spread of markets. And then I look at a particular case, let's say Danish healthcare, and I say, oh look, markets have spread, that's due to neoliberalism. Well, you don't know that. You haven't shown me that neoliberal ideas underlay the practice. But tacitly what you're doing is saying neoliberal is spreading. When I find an example, I can explain that by saying it's a function of the whole. So neoliberalism is the whole, and the example is an example of a function coming out. So in a lot of governmentality, what you get is a tacit functionalism that actually collapses into exactly what I've been criticising in this slide here, a form of institutionalism. So we need to be very wary of assuming that genealogies are critical and straightforwardly work, and we need to be careful we're not falling into institutionalism. And much of what I'm going to do in the rest of the talk is trying to get around that gap. And the way I'm going to try and get around that gap is also heavily critical of kind of Foucauldian and governmentality perspectives. And I'm going to just state that to find a form of subjectivity, call it neoliberal subjectivity, evoked in policy texts does not mean that form of subjectivity actually exists. We would be better off thinking of policy texts as a bit like novels. They're stories that policymakers are telling us. The idea that you can read those texts and not do anything else and assume that those texts tell us how the world works is beyond naive. But that's what most governmentality work does. Its empirical data is almost entirely official texts. Right? What we actually should be doing is going out and looking at how these policies work. So from that perspective, what I've done so far is give you a genealogy of how and why policymakers have tried to spread markets and networks. At no point have I done anything to suggest that they have succeeded in doing so. So now for the rest of the talk, let's very briefly have a bit of fun and ask ourselves, how successful have they been? Or, because I don't really know how I would answer that question, let's look at why they haven't succeeded through a series of examples of people resisting them. So this is actually, it probably won't be yours, but this is my best example. I really like this example of resistance. This example is a civil servant, very high up, head of the Department of Defence, called Sir Richard Mottram. And I'll read you out the quote, though you can all read it for yourself. Sir Richard Mottram, when interviewed, said to us, "When I was in defence, we had long since discovered joined-up government. It's presented as such a revolutionary idea, but I had worked for my whole career in defence on the basis that we joined up everything we did with the Foreign Office and with the Cabinet and with 10 Downing Street. It was just deep in our culture that this was the way you worked, and we got it off to a fine art." Doesn't sound like resistance. Some of you are probably thinking, that's not resistance. He likes it. He's all for it. No, that's resistance. Let me explain why. Tony Blair has just been elected. Tony Blair is introducing what he thinks is a revolutionary agenda that's going to transform the British senior civil service. A senior civil servant who is directly responsible for implementing that revolutionary reform agenda is going, great idea, but I don't actually need to do anything, do I? For all of you who don't fill in a form that the university sends you, you're doing what Sir Richard Mottram is doing. It's passive resistance. I don't think Richard Mottram is even doing it in the way, that's a bad analogy, because when I don't fill in forms, I know I'm being a bit naughty. I don't think Sir Richard Mottram does know he's doing that. Right? I think he thinks he's implementing it. And that gets me to another thing, which is going to be important. Why is Sir Richard Mottram doing what he's doing? He's doing what he's doing because he's a British civil servant. British civil servants are trained in a culture of Whiggism. For those of you who don't know, Whiggism is a distinctly British constitutional doctrine which really says the British Constitution is the best of all possible worlds, but every now and again that's a bit of a flaw in it, and then we need to very, very slightly tweak it to keep it up to date. So that's what he's really saying. He's saying we do things really, really well already. It's already there. Of course it is. If it wasn't already sort of there, it wouldn't be a good idea because the British Constitution is more or less perfect. But, you know, it's a pretty good thing. But yeah, there may be a few small tweaks needed. So what he's doing is reading a reform agenda which was promoted by institutionalists who thought it was a really radical reform agenda that would transform bureaucracy. He's reading that through a Whiggish narrative, which makes it a very small reform agenda within a basically decent system. Let's move on to my next example. And this is a police officer. I like this too. I actually like all my examples. I wouldn't have picked them if I didn't, would I? Right. This is a police officer. God, you've got to love this, haven't you? Command and control is situational. In my team, I don't have subordinates, I have team members. I'm sure we all know this. I can talk this language. Presumably you can all talk this language. Anyone who's done anything vaguely managerial in the last 30 years can surely turn out this language in their sleep, right? I don't have subordinates, I have team members. I invite their ideas and input and encourage them to talk to me, yeah, blah, blah. However, so you know he's about to change that. As I said, it's situational. Terrorism is a good example. Can we just pause there? Is it? Terrorism is a good example for the main work that police do on a daily basis? No, it really isn't. It's actually a really, really bad example, right? But no, let's stick with him. Terrorism is a good example. As a commander in a crisis, which of course the bad example of terrorism sets him up to be, as a commander in a crisis, when I want something done, it isn't up for negotiation. I tell the troops we have to rely on command and control in these situations. Now, I can't prove what I'm about to say, but just to bring out the full, I've done more work on police than I would like to have done. I actually find it really, really interesting because being an ex-British lefty Marxist, I tend to think they're naturally fascists. So it's quite interesting having to find out that they're not and deal with that fact. But I absolutely guarantee you that he actually thinks that virtually every moment in his policing career becomes a crisis. Right? Police think they are virtually always acting in a mode of crisis. Some of them have the misfortune of having to go around and do community policing, but they don't much like it. They didn't join up to do it. What they want to do is stop criminals and bad guys, and doing that is a bit like a crisis. Right? So it's not as though what he's really saying is I spend most of my time with team members, but every now and again when you get something like terrorism, I need to revert to command and control. What he's really saying is command and control remains the default mode for virtually everything that police do. So that is massive resistance. Right, and it's coming from a senior-ish police officer. And what he's really saying is, yeah, I quite like the idea of community policing, but it's basically a nice little add-on to our core business, which is going to remain not about networks into the community, etc., but command and control within a hierarchic police organisation. Then my final example, you can see we're going down the hierarchy, senior civil servant, street-level bureaucrat, not quite, but that it stands that. And then finally, citizens. A health user, got to have some sympathy with this. Actually, it was a woman. I was about to say guy, but it was a woman. Health user says, patient is the traditional term, and I think it is still appropriate. The NHS is a service to customers in the local community. I know consumer and customer employ choice, and that is what we are supposed to want. I would consider it an acceptable achievement if everyone could have what was best in the matter of treatment as of right. There are certain cost considerations, but that is another issue. Choice may be a political ploy to take our eye off the ball and confuse us as to what really matters. Choice sounds a good thing, but is it? Right? So obviously this patient disagrees with policy, but I would also suggest this is going to lead to a form of active resistance, because according to, let's say, consumerist models, the patient is largely meant to follow pricing indicators. And I can more or less, again, more or less, like you can't prove this, but I can more or less guarantee that this patient and a load of others like her are not going to follow pricing indicators. They're going to follow their comfort with their existing GP, for instance, rather than move just because there's a bit of economic advantage to moving. So the policy's not going to work out in quite the way that it's been designed to work out, because the patient is not going to act in the way that a rational consumer is meant to act. Right? So again, it's a form of resistance there. Well, we really are almost at the end. I have a list of things at the end which I cannot be more bored by, but there you go. That's what I think it matters, where I think we are. This is because, people do like you to tell them what the world looks like. As far as I can make out, for what it's worth, I'm not really interested in these generalisations. Bureaucracy still exists, markets are resisted, and community networks are neglected. Instead of ending on that note, I want to point out, kind of bring together my theoretical points, which I think are much more interesting because I'm a theorist. And I want to explain how my critique has worked. So you will notice that as I moved into the section on resistance, I said genealogy is not inherently critical. And merely to evoke something like power is not a critique. Right? When genealogy becomes critical, if you know, say, I don't know, Nietzsche's Genealogy and Morality, think of that as a good example. When genealogy becomes critical is when it tells a narrative of the rise of a practice or set of ideas which the people involved in that practice with those set of ideas cannot adopt without altering those ideas. So if you are a Christian subjected to Nietzsche's critique, and you think, oh, well, actually Christianity only arose out of a desire of kind of resentment, a nasty evil desire, then it's impossible to go on straightforwardly being a Christian. Right? So genealogies work when the stories they tell are incompatible with those held by the targets of those stories. So if we now look again at my examples of resistance, they're not meant to be just nice stories of people resisting policies. They're meant to be examples of how modernist social science fails. They're meant to be examples of people acting in ways that break with the kinds of modernist rationalities I showed earlier. Hence the emphasis I placed on the senior civil servant Sir Richard Mottram acting in accord with a Whig tradition. What they're meant to show is that people act on inherited local traditions and beliefs which do not conform to either economic rationality or sociological rationality. And moreover, the histories, I think you could also argue that the history I told at the beginning is semi-incompatible with neoliberalism or with economic rationality and sociological rationality. I actually think that's quite a serious theoretical point. If I was a rational choice theorist, I'm not, but if I was, this is a bit polarising, but it makes the point polemically. If I was, and I thought rational choice was correct, presumably because rational choice is a theory of social life, I would have to account for the rise of rational choice theory using rational choice theory. And that would make rational choice theory look a bit odd. It certainly is not the way you would convince someone that it was true to say, well, people adopt it and spread it because it serves their interests in these ways. Likewise, if I was an institutionalist, I would presumably have to explain the rise of, let's say, the new institutionalism by appealing to something like, say, path dependency and critical junctures. Again, that's a bit odd. It's not clear why that would convince me. So I actually think even the early stories are semi-incompatible with modernist social science. And the examples of resistance, I think, are clearly incompatible with them. So the way the critique works is that the story I tell undercuts the theories I want to attack. Right? It's not just that I have an alternative story, it's that it actively undercuts the forms of social science that I'm trying to criticise. Thank you very much.
So I love the broad sweep of your theory. Now, broad theories aren't sunk by picking little holes in them, but can I suggest one little hole and see how you respond? So you argued that principal-agent theory presupposes economic rationality, and that doesn't develop until the late 19th, early 20th century. But Bentham and Rousseau both give a pretty clear account of principal-agent theory when they're discussing representation. So Rousseau, in his little book on Poland, says that you have to elect representatives every 6 weeks on a precise set of instructions, and if they don't do what you say, you kill them. Now, Rousseau isn't an exponent of economic rationality, Bentham is, but they're both writing long before you say economic rationality is developing. So how does your theory address that challenge?
I guess I don't really want to go into the long route I will be taken by this, but I'll try and keep it brief. So I think the answer has to do with how I would understand aggregate concepts. So because underlying what I'm trying to say is that the kind of aggregate concepts that prevail in social science, like state, don't pick out entities. Right? There's no entity that's the state with an essence. So aggregate concepts are things that we create at a level of description that suits us. Right? So I might refer to, let's say, everyone in London as a Londoner. Right? They all live in London, they're all Londoners. It's not a false description, particularly if I stipulate what I'm doing and calling that Londoners. Or I might say, well, actually, I'm going to restrict the concept to people who are born in London. Now, there's no right or wrong between those concepts. I'm using the same word for both of them. So the aggregate concepts don't capture natural kinds, really. They're descriptive things we can use. What that means is that when we're looking particularly at an intellectual movement or an idea, in this case, economic rationality, there's no one correct way of defining what we mean by it. So if somebody wants, they can do what you've just done and stretch the concept of economic rationality so that it applies not just to what's happened in neoclassical economics, but back to, say, Bentham or Hobbes. But they do so at the expense of ignoring all the massive ruptures that occur between Hobbes and Bentham, let alone between Hobbes and neoclassical economics or Bentham and neoclassical economics. So for my purposes, I'm just defining economic rationality more narrowly than you are, right? And I would justify defining it that way, not by saying that's the correct way to define it, but by saying that's the way to define it to best get the kind of explanation of the phenomenon I'm after.
Could I have a very quick comeback? So I think you said that principal agent theory assumes the idea of moral hazard, and moral hazard, you can't think of moral hazard without economic rationality. You didn't say that. What was it you said about what you need for to assume moral hazard?
I said principal agency arose an issue of moral hazard. I said principal agent theory presupposed an economic form of rationality.
So, Mark, I'm going to ask you, looking at the final part of the presentation there, where you're talking about what critique actually is in those circumstances, is an implication of what you're saying that no reforms can ever work? Because the people who are coming up with the reforms, whatever the kind of ideas there might be, whether they're neoliberal reforms, institutionalist reforms, some other kind of reform, they're always going to be resisted by agents on the ground who have some different interpretation of what should actually be happening, rooted in their own particular traditions. Is that an implication of this?
Sort of. I mean, it's certainly something I would loosely agree with. But equally, of course, you could. The point I would want to emphasise instead of that, though, is that for reforms that presuppose the correctness of modernist social science are doomed to fail, right? You can imagine other sorts of reforms which wouldn't imagine success in the same way, right? Because modernist social science imagines in some ways that it's, I think this is overly simplistic, but insofar as modernist social science imagines that it's generating correct explanations, those correct explanations provide some sort of a basis for postulating something like predictability, which it's easy to then transform into, we can tell you that these reforms will have this effects, or at least we can tell you that in X percentage of cases they will have these effects, right? But you can imagine forms of reform where there isn't the same notion of predictability built in, right? Think of things that seek to spread democratic practices, for instance. It's not clear what would constitute success. It would be if, I mean, I guess you could argue this is what Cameron thought with the referendum, couldn't you? If you thought you knew what the outcome of the alleged democratic innovation would be, and it wasn't, then you could say the reform failed. But if all you're trying to do is introduce the practice, then you could say, well, the practice doesn't quite correspond to how I would have described it in advance. But particularly if all you're really saying is, here is a way of exploring how to best introduce greater participation or novel styles of participation, it's harder to imagine how you could quite so straightforwardly say, this has failed. But equally, at another level, I think, yes, what you're saying is true. But I worry that it ignores the key distinction between why modernist social science is particularly liable to generate failing policies in a way that other forms of knowledge might not be.
But could you have, for example, either the institutionalist reforms or the neoliberal reforms introduced through some kind of different mechanism which goes against this kind of problem? Could they be introduced in a way that isn't based on some notion of predictability, that's some kind of adaptable notion of themselves, that as they're applied, they have to be adapted and reinterpreted as people interact with them?
Possibly. I mean, I think then they would be different reforms, though. Again, it would be this, it would take me back to the aggregate concepts. But if you were doing that, it would seem to me that the mode of knowledge underlying the reform would be so different from what it actually was that you would really be talking about a different reform, right? I mean, let's run with the democracy example a bit again, because I think it's quite topical at the moment, because there's an awful lot of academic work done on not only things like deliberative democracy, but also things like co-production, which can look like they're sidestepping this problem. And in a way they are, right? So I have two ways of telling this story. You didn't really get either today, but you can imagine this story. You can imagine it as, I probably got nearer to today, as a fairly Nietzschean narrative, or Weberian or Foucauldian, in which we're trapped in a nasty modernist economic rationality that's colonising ever more parts of our life. But you can also imagine telling it as a slightly more Hegelian story, right? In which you move from bureaucracy to markets or networks almost in a dialectic. And at the end, people are increasingly adopting looser and looser and more democratic forms of networks, which maybe is a solution to the imprisonment of modernity. So you can imagine kind of democracy coming in as a sort of solution in a way. And I can sort of see that. But I also think that when you look at the academic work on deliberative democracy, much of it recently has taken what's called the empirical turn in deliberative democracy. And what happens then is that deliberative democracy is treated as something that can be studied, loosely speaking, from a positivist or modernist perspective. So you can try to find out, under circumstances X, deliberative practices will work, under circumstances Y, they won't. Well, that's a kind of formal form of knowledge that's not about historical context. The relevant circumstances are defined in a way that's meant to transcend time and place, right? So it looks more like a modernist form of knowledge. And part of the problem with that, apart from the fact that I don't like it, part of the problem is it's surely incompatible with deliberative democracy. I mean, deliberative democracy presupposes that the agents who are going to be doing the deliberating are capable of altering their opinions for reasons of their own. What that means is the outcomes and nature of their deliberation cannot be decided by things outside themselves. So adopting the empirical turn in deliberative democracy turns it into a modernist agenda in a way that actually seems to me to be incompatible with it. So I would then want to describe those, getting back to the aggregate concepts thing, I would want to describe modernist deliberative democracy as different from, say, a humanist deliberative democracy.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I didn't want to go necessarily in a discussion about interpretivist versus positivist takes, but I guess I'm going to be that guy and say, doesn't Brexit emerge from this sort of conversation as a rejection of this sort of Blairite centrism, essentially? It's a different idea altogether. That it's just a rejection of supra-governance talk. It's a rejection of, my polls are going to give me the answer to the election. It seems like we were all kind of wrong about what we believed about modernity as liberals, and we should go back and get a hard think about that, be a little bit of a Nietzschean last man in my question.
Yeah, I mean, possibly. I genuinely mean that. I mean, I don't really know. I mean, and part of the problem is that apart from we would like to leave the European Union, it's not clear what policies Brexit stands for, right? So it's hard to say, well, it's something that entirely rejects modernism, or maybe, I mean, let's think of some of the conservative supporters of Brexit. You can imagine narratives for Brexit where the justification for Brexit becomes the importance of free trade and free markets, which are more or less guaranteed to have these circumstances. You can also imagine the counter-institutionalist arguments, which is, no, Britain's so heavily dependent upon the EU, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I'm not an economist, so I can easily say this. I don't know. I have I don't believe anyone who tells me they do know. I don't believe anyone can tell me whether the British economy will look better or worse 50 or 100 years from now as a result of Brexit. I just don't believe it. I can't believe that anyone thinks they know, right? And I actually feel a bit annoyed when someone says that. You can have a guess, and I can guarantee that it will be a bit bumpy for a few years and a bit unpleasant for a few years. But long term, who knows? Right? Who even knows if the rest of the EU will still be there in 50 to 100 years, So I don't, I sort of is what I can say. I mean, I think what I could say is a lot of the Brexit voters probably look like, loosely, I don't like the idea, right-wing populism. I think that too acts as a reified category that categorises things as if they all shared a similar essence when they don't. Right? So I would much rather talk about things more differentiatedly than that suggests. But if we talk about right-wing populism as a generic thing, I think you might want to say that right-wing populism can look a bit like a right-wing version of my health citizen, right? It's someone who just doesn't like what's going on, and moreover is not supporting or acting in the way that they're meant to act. They're not following the official scripts.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you about the connection between genealogy and social critique, or lack thereof, which you mentioned twice. And I found your claim that genealogies are not inherently critical very enlightening, but I do think that they have a slightly greater potential to lead to social criticism than you give them credit for. Because one of your arguments, which again I agree with, is that the notion of power plays a very important role in social critique. So if genealogies don't uncover that, you want to say that they're not inherently conducive to social criticism. But I think one of the important things that the genealogy does is to question or even prove that some things which we consider natural are actually a social construct. And that's not bringing it down to issues of power directly, but that still creates scope for social criticism, or it creates the space for other people to come in and say, yes, hold on, so these things are constructed, but then who had an interest in constructing them as such? And then we uncover actually structures of social domination. So I think that genealogies have a potential to be slightly more revolutionary, or lead to social critique more easily, or on a more widespread scale than you thought. So I was wondering what...
Yeah, so I'll start, just before I get on to the point about genealogy, I'll just start with power. So what I was trying to say about power is as it's currently used in a lot of critical theory, it's a slippery concept. So if you read Foucault on power, power is everywhere and it's also productive, which means you simply can't move from power to structures of domination in the way that you did. On the contrary, for Foucault, power doesn't have a centre. So the way he's using power and things is incompatible with ideas of structures that build this in, right? They might be there, but that would be a descriptive claim, and it certainly wouldn't have a structuring effect where the structure explained instances of it. That would be incompatible with Foucault. He might agree descriptively the practices like you described it, but I don't think he could be happy, not in his genealogy phrase, with referring to it as anything like a structure of domination. And that's where power is slippery, right? So if you use power in a Foucauldian way, it's everywhere and always with you, so it's a descriptive concept, so it can't do critical work. As soon as you try to give it critical work, you're going to end up using exactly the sort of notion of power that Foucault was reacting again, where you're ascribing some sort of centre to it, right? You have a dominating group and a dominated group. That's to ascribe some sort of centre to it, where it has an essence and a logic in how it's working. And that's to slip into the kind of functionalist, institutionalist forms of social science, which I think happens everywhere. In effect, at least 50 to 60% of Foucauldian scholarship isn't Foucauldian, it's Althusserian. And it uses power in a form of social control, Marxist-like language, even if it mimics other bits of Foucauldian language. And then moving on to genealogy, I just entirely agree with you. I mean, what I actually said was genealogies are critical when the people can't accept them. So the key thing in what you said is not that it denaturalizes, but that people think it's natural, right? So if the people don't think it's natural, right? If we all accept, let us say, we all accept that, let's pick something like, we all accept that sexuality is a constructed notion, right? Let's imagine we do, even if we don't for the moment. Then to tell us a story about how the concepts arise historically and how they're constructed has no critical effect because it doesn't undercut our ideas. But if we believe that it's natural and someone tells us a story which shows it's not, it's constructed, and they denaturalise something, then yes, absolutely, that's exactly when I think it's critical, because the story that's then told is incompatible with the story that is targeted. And that's an excellent example of what I mean about how and when it has critical purchase.
So much. I just was curious if you have any explanation or theory about where novel ideas come from. So you're giving this sort of very ideational account of policy and social change, and I'm just wondering if there's any story behind the development of these ideas, or whether or not it's simply a sort of a random process where academics come up with new ways of looking at the world, and there isn't any sort of teleology to it.
You know, I have two answers to that. The second's a bit dodgy. It's going to take me into territory I probably shouldn't slip into, but it's honest, so I'll give it. The first answer is that new ideas arise all the time. We all have them all the time. I'm staying in the Strand Palace Hotel. I'm a Londoner, as I said earlier. I've been to virtually every pub along for the whole of the Strand and the Fleet Street. I thought I'll go out for a drink last night. I went out for a drink. I actually texted my wife first, and she says, oh, go to the Punch and Judy, because I used to meet a cousin of mine at the Punch and Judy, once a month. So I went there, but there was only standing room, and I'm old, in case you can't see, I'm old, I'm really old. So I didn't want to stand up all night. I wanted to sit down and read my Kindle in a nice little old pub in a nook by myself. So I thought, nah. So I wandered back and I tried a couple of others. I tried the Lyceum, no joy there. And I tried the Coal Hole, no joy there. And then I spotted the Savoy Tap. I didn't even know that existed, right? And I went in and it was a nice pub. So if I come back next time, maybe I think, oh, I'll go to the Savoy Tap. Now, obviously, my knowledge there, my new idea, has arisen from a new experience. I've seen it and gone in, but it's a new idea I've got. Obviously, it's not necessarily new to everyone, but it's a new idea. If I discover a new driving route, I can't drive, so I'm not going to do that, but you might discover a new driving route, then I've got a new idea. So we all have new ideas the whole time, whether consciously, subconsciously, or unconsciously. That's probably not a very helpful answer, because what you mean is not where new ideas come from. What you mean is, where do these sorts of new ideas come from? The ideas that impact policy making. And the problem with giving an answer to that, and this is why I said my second answer is going to be a bit dodgy, is that you're kind of suggesting a pattern, which is easy to look as though it resembles an institutionalist mode of explanation. So bear in mind, I'm not trying to explain the rise of these ideas in what I'm about to say. What I'm doing is offering a generalisation of things that I think, since loosely speaking, 1918, could probably go back to 1880, since 1918, have been really instrumental in three transformations of the state. The rise of socialism / the welfare state, the rise of neoliberalism / Thatcherism, which I've mentioned here, and also the other one I've mentioned here, the rise of joined up governance networks and the Blair government. I found the Blair government really interesting. I really lost interest with the coalition, because they didn't have anything like such a clear agenda. There were bits of markets here, bits of networks there, and no nice underlying narrative that a kind of philosophically, theoretically obsessed person like me could get to grips with. So it all just became a bit dull. And as far as I can see, if you really want to change the world, Mark's Guide to Changing the World, here you go. 1, get a good set of new ideas. Don't know where from. I've just said I don't know where they come from, right? The academics dream them up. Typically it is academics. Even with the socialist one, you wouldn't want to say it was academics, but it was, let's call them intellectuals. Because there were so many less universities, it was intellectuals. Get them to develop, and make sure they're insane, because they're going to be in a small minority who everyone will think is nuts for a very long time. So it helps that they should be a bit crazy, right? A bit messianically driven, like the Webbs and George Bernard Shaw, you know, really a bit loony about it all, right? So those should be your starting people who come up with this idea and driven. But perhaps because they're a bit nuts and a bit marginal, they're not that useful in themselves. So what you then need is an organisations of, organisationally controlled groups, which will typically involve journalists, sympathetic businessmen who will help to provide funds and other such things to cluster around these ideas. So obviously the Webbs and Shaw form the Fabian Society, you get other socialist groups that are similar, you get the Adam Smith Institute, you get Demos, right, to go through my 3 examples. So now we've got the crazy ideas, and now we've got the people around them who are willing to fund them and promote them in the press and other such places. And then third, and crucially, absolutely crucially, you need 1, a crisis, and you need 2, a compelling narrative rooted in your ideas, which explains why that crisis has happened and what you're going to do about it, right? And the crisis can be something that in part you bring into existence through the story you tell, but you need it, right? So there needs to be a felt problem, a genuine felt problem with what's going on at the moment, right? We need homes for heroes. Your soldiers can't come back to this rubbish, right? We can't have dead people lying in the streets. Obviously we didn't, but the right-wing press was almost suggesting we did in the 1970s. They were certainly suggesting garbage was everywhere, and there were stories of up in Liverpool that you couldn't get your dead buried because undertakers were on strike. Right? Gravediggers, I think it was, not undertakers. So you need some sense of a real crisis, right? And then you need a narrative that explains the crisis and explains why you've got an answer. So the real hero of New Labour should be Kinnock, not Blair. It should be Kinnock, because Kinnock took the Labour Party from something that was destined to lose and didn't have a narrative, and he introduced all the reforms that we think of as New Labour through his policy review. Every single reform, right? You look for it, it's quite interesting. I did a comparison of Kinnock and Giddens, right? Because everyone thought the third way came from Giddens. Every single policy from the third way that Blair adopted had been adopted by Kinnock's policy reform. Every policy that Giddens proposed that hadn't already been adopted by Kinnock was not adopted by Blair. right? So that tells you something about what's happening, which is a wider group of intellectuals, not one person, are developing these ideas. They're developing as a cluster. There's never going to be one hero who does it by themselves. There's a group. They have a network of people, and then they have a crisis and a narrative. So socialists, we can't treat people like this. We need to deal with poverty, etc., etc. The welfare state is going to be a solution. State action is going to be a solution. That's why the Fabians are important. Fabians are much, much more important than Marx, because Marx didn't tell people what to do. So it was utterly meaningless. That's why the Russian Revolution ended up in the way it did, because no one knew what to do. They just thought everywhere else would have a revolution. That's the nearest Marx got to telling them what was going to happen. The Fabians, it's a bit of a disaster, but what they said was you just need to tax people and then build social goods, which is a much simpler story that you can apply across everything, right? And that's what happened. Thatcher, again, simple story. The problem is the state is bloated, it's not working. What we need is markets that will make it inherently efficient, right? So you need a story about what's wrong, right? And New Labour had that. And that I just briefly getting back to Brexit, for those of, let's call it us, so I'll own up to still being on the left here. For those of us who are on the left is a total disaster at the moment because it's not within shouting distance of a narrative, right? It's got a bunch of people who want to go into various forms of critique, right? It's got a bunch of rainbow coalition-like identities that it wants to support or causes that it wants to support. It's like the Liberals in the 1870s and 1880s when it was seen as a faddist party that adopted a load of fads. And totally missing from its centre is a core narrative about how we got where we are, why the problems have arisen, and how we're going to solve them across the board generically. And that narrative doesn't have to be spot on and accurate, but you've got to have it and it's got to be plausible so that people can understand it.
Thank you. Yeah, so you're saying that we should move, social science should move away from modernism, and I've just got a question about what it would be moving to. And I know you published a book recently on interpretive social science, which I look forward to reading. I've not read that yet, so I'm guessing that you're advocating some form of interpretive approach. But I'd like to just hear a bit more about what that alternative approach is, but also how it relates to what you describe as previously modernist approaches. So I'm thinking of, say, you're describing public choice theory as a modernist approach and institutionalism, but would you agree that within those previous traditions there have also been moves perhaps away from positivism? So within public choice there are various kinds of public choice, and some of those perhaps move a bit away from positivism, and also within institutionalism as well you've got work done on, say, discursive institutionalism and how institutions become discursively constructed. So maybe is it a kind of radical break that you're advocating, or is it just building on previous work as well? Because there's been a lot of work done on interpretivism from people. And I guess another question I have is, you look at some of the interpretivist work. So for example, Frank Fisher, for example, is in work on interpretive policy analysis. It's very interesting and sort of rich in its analysis. I'm not always sure how much you get from it in terms of actually leading to any kind of recommendation. So if in the end we all become interpretivists, where does that leave research that actually does seek to engage with questions about reform and, improving governance? Right.
I don't suppose get to dealing with all of that. I'll try. If I forget anything in particular, remind me. So I realise now what a hole I've dug for myself in my last comments about the left, because my standard answer to that is that I don't really know, and I like to think of this as being a bit analogous to Marx. He knew he didn't like capitalism, he didn't know what would come after, but he knew it wouldn't be capitalism, and I don't know what will come after modernism, but I know I don't like modernism. But I can't quite go for that answer given what I just said about what the left needs, can I? I think the nearest I can get to a quick answer is that, by and large, I think when people talk about approaches to social science, like the interpretive social science in this case, they're bundling together a cluster of things: a philosophy, a preference for a range of topics, and a series of methodological techniques. And those things rarely go together. So in the case of Frank Fisher, for instance, I think he has you could arguably add in and also an ethical perspective, but I don't think that's right. In the case of Frank Fisher, I think he has a clear commitment to certain methodological things. I think he has a fairly clear political ethical commitment. I haven't got the faintest idea what his philosophical commitments are. He churns out the odd language, but it's always very unclear to me. And they don't always fit together. So I certainly don't want to speak on behalf of all interpretivists. I can only tell you what I think. But for me, the core thing is philosophical, not methodological. And I think most philosophies are compatible with most methodologies, which I'll come to a bit when you responded to what you asked about rational choice and sociological institutionalism. But in the case of more the kind of philosophy that I think underlies an interpretive approach, I think it's one that would again be historicist. So it would move away from these formal things, and it would instead see these things as historically constructed, as we've just said. It would see them as things where the aggregate concepts never pick out natural kinds, but are descriptive, or they're adopted pragmatically as things that explain the particulars that interest us. So really it would be a historicist mode of understanding, but absence the developmental strand where things are seen as inherently progressive and rational that was there in the 19th century. And that progressive developmentalism would be replaced with an emphasis on contingency and contestability. It's the nearest I can get to a quick answer to that. And that, I think, then feeds quite nicely into the question of how does this relate to changes within rational choice and institutionalism, and are they making a similar move? And in a spirit of polemicism, I'm going to say no. Right? I could say yes, they're moved, but let's be polemical and say no. So let's start with rational choice theory and the like. I think there are things that maybe, can look a bit like they're moving in that direction. So rational choice theorists, for instance, the one who's been in my department for longest tends to write in the odd article or in places things like, if the model works, that proves it's true, which strikes me as obviously false, but there you go. I don't think he really cares whether that claim is true or not. It's just a way of shutting people who argue against him up, which is an important point, actually. Whereas the younger ones are more likely to say that the models they develop are valid, not true. So they're internally mathematically consistent, but that doesn't mean they're true. And moreover, they're likely to say the role of the model is not to uncapture the world as it is, but rather to provide a heuristic with which we may think. Right? So what you've got is a shift from rational choice is correct in its assumptions and therefore its models are true to, well, they're valid deductively and they might be useful tools for thinking, which is obviously a much weaker claim and one I wouldn't argue with. Right? That's part of in a way, the methodological agnosticism here. It's about the philosophy for me. Obviously, I think the models are deductively valid. Well, they should be. If the maths is done properly, they're going to be deductively valid. And equally clearly, they can serve a useful heuristic function. So that can look like what you've got is someone who's interested in rational choice moving directly onto my sort of theoretical terrain. The problem is they don't really mean it. What they're actually doing is paying lip service to my terrain, but not adopting it. Because if they adopted it, at least if they were sincere and intelligent, they might be insincere or they might be unintelligent. But if they're sincere and intelligent, once they've moved onto the terrain where these models are valid and they're useful as heuristics, they raise new questions that they never address. One, what are the criteria for a good heuristic? Two, why does my model meet those criteria better than, say, reading a Shakespearean play? Three, what exactly is the role of a heuristic in academic thought or in policy making? And those questions are never addressed. So if we think, I don't know how many of you will know this reference, but I'll throw it out and hope you do. If we think in the terms raised by a superb philosopher of science of the 70s, Imre Lakatos, what you have is what he would describe as a degenerative research program rather than a progressive one. Faced with the kind of philosophical criticisms I'm offering, what these rational choice scholars are doing is offering ad hoc hypotheses. Oh, it's just deductively valid. Oh, it's just a heuristic to fend off the criticism, but they're not driving forward a progressive new research agenda around those criticisms. Right? So yeah, sure, they're moving onto my terrain, but they're not really They're just doing so to fend off criticism. There's no real interest in exploring the philosophical issues they thereby raise. In fact, here's an open challenge. I will pause, but not for long because I like to talk. Can anyone mention a single article by a neoclassical economist or rational choice theory that discusses what is a good heuristic criteria, why neoclassical economics or rational choice is particularly likely to develop good heuristics, and what exactly the role of a heuristic should be in intellectual life and or policy making? Because I don't know one, but obviously I don't know all the literature. Right, we'll take the silence as no. Right, so that shows just how uniformly this is actually a degenerative research program rather than a progressive research program. Now let's look at something like the discursive institutionalism. Again, slightly polemically, it can look like it because what they seem to be saying is, well, institutions aren't natural kinds that just exist. They arise discursively and they're constructed like this. Great. Sounds very like what I want to say. But again, it's just lip service. Because what that serves as, it serves as an account of how the institution arises. But as soon as the institution has arisen through this discursive process, it has at its heart a discursive norm or a discursive rule or a set of rules or a set of norms which define it as its essence and define how it will act. Right? So there's no real serious reflection on if this institution is made by ideas, and if the ideas vary, why aren't we actually looking at constant and ongoing contestation and contingency in the way in which the institution develops? So again, what you have is a degenerative research program where I actually really like Colin Hay, who I'm obviously picking on here. I have an awful lot of time for him. But what's going on is more solid, past X as in past more mainstream institutionalists, even tied into forms of Marxism and the state, are trying to cling to reified sociological categories like state and institution while paying lip service to the sorts of arguments I make. And that's a degenerative research program, not a progressive one, because the ideas they're adopting are not then being used to actually radically transform what they're doing. I think I covered everything.
Do we have any more questions? I don't think we do, but we've actually had Mark for an hour and a half on his feet and answering questions, so it's certainly given me food for thought, and I hope it's given you the same. I think we should all give a very warm round of applause to Professor Mark Bevir.